how you doing? It's Luke from lukecurtis.co.uk, and today I am going to talk about shooting in manual. So manual's like, it's almost like the holy grail. Manual and raw is almost like the holy grail of photography to a lot of photographers, especially for newbies. Like, you're trying to get into photography and you hear about all these professionals shooting in manual and you're like, oh god, I've got to shoot in manual before I can be deemed as a professional. So manual basically gives you the control to control everything. You have the creative ability to apply your knowledge to be able to get the best results. Now, cameras will have a load of different modes. They'll have like shutter priority, they'll have aperture priority, and then they'll have automatic. So automatic, if we start there, that's a safe bet. That's basically the camera using its intelligence to decide what are the best settings to take that picture. And that can be great. Like, I'll be totally honest with you, I've gone on holiday a few times, turned my camera to auto and just snapped away. And the freedom that gives you is amazing, because all of a sudden you're not trying to think about your ISO or your shutter speed or your aperture. You're basically just shooting what you see, and there's so much fun in that. And other professionals can criticise me all they want for saying, oh, he's not a pro for shooting in automatic. Hey, I don't need to, I don't need to do anything to prove that I'm a professional. On a holiday, you want to relax. If it was a paid commission, yeah, of course I'd take total control. But the benefit I get from using automatic would be, if I was out with my daughter or my partner, I could just hand my camera over to either one of them and they can start using it, which is amazing. There's no downtime. You capture what you see, and there's a real purity in that, which is fantastic. So automatic mode is the safest bet, and that's probably where a lot of people will start. And with modern cameras nowadays, automatic comes away with some really good results. So take, for instance, the A7 or the A7S or the A7R2. Stick that in automatic with a half decent lens in it, and yeah, I can guarantee you will come away with some really good images. But you're not in control. The camera is in control. And where that falls down is where there's scenarios where the camera is always going to try and look for the best exposure, but it doesn't factor in if there's moving subjects and all that sort of jazz. Like, it doesn't have the intelligence to do that. It's just going to look for the best exposure. Now, my career, I started off as a music photographer working in nightclubs, and it's progressed into festivals, and now I'm a portrait photographer of musicians, and I do some commercial stuff within the industry as well. Because I started off in dark environments with moving subjects, it was impossible to use automatic. I had to learn very fast how to shoot in manual to give me full control over those scenarios, and also using my flash. So I've been shooting in manual pretty much from the start, or forced to shoot in manual. And we'll go into sort of more in manual a little bit later, but initially automatic, safe bet. Not always great, because the camera doesn't have the intelligence to get you out of it. And if you're starting off and you're in automatic, like, don't feel bad. Like, everyone has to start there, of course, and it gives you a good idea of what your camera is capable. But when you start to look underneath the bonnet and see what the camera's actually doing, you are more intelligent as a photographer than your camera. Yes, your camera is more technologically advanced and can make decisions quicker than you, but you can be so much more smarter in terms of applying your knowledge to the situation. The camera can't do that. It can't feel, it can't sense, it can't do any of that sort of stuff. The second mode that you'll get beyond automatic will be something like aperture priority. Now, what aperture priority is going to do is it's going to adjust the other settings based on what you decide the aperture is going to be. And what is aperture? So aperture, have you ever seen one of those images where at the moment you can probably see the background's a little bit blurred, and as I come closer towards you, you'll see I'm blurred, but I'll start to come into focus and the background will go further out of focus. Now, that is done by using the aperture. As you open the aperture up, which is really weird, because actually in terms of how it physically looks, you're closing it down. So if I give you an example, so I'm going to turn this on, and if I hold this directly to you now, wait for it to fall into focus. Okay, cool, fantastic. We are in focus. Hold on one second, I'm just going to get right in there if we can, so you guys can see. Yeah, no, we were better here. Cool. If you watch, I have got my aperture right open at f22. Sorry, I've got it right close at f22. Now I'm going to open it up. To open it up, I have to go down in numbers. So I'm at 22, I'm slowly going down. I'm at 16, I'm at 14, I'm at 10, I'm at 8, I'm at 7. I'm going down, I'm going down, I'm going as far as I can, which is 1.8. If I was to take a picture at 1.8, and which I will, so if this is a 50mm, and for demonstration purposes, I'm going to stick it in auto. And that's going to shoot that at 2.5. Now if I show you this image, have a little nose at that chap. Oh, get my face out of the way and it will focus on. Cool, you see that? My hand is in focus, but the background's out of focus. Now that's at 2.5. If I did it at 1.8 or 1.4 or open up even wider, the background falls more out of focus. And that's great. And the reason that's great is because it puts the subject is in focus. That's what you want the person looking at the picture staring at, the subject, and now in focus, and there's nothing else distracting it on the background. So that's what the aperture does. And aperture priority mode is basically you decide what aperture you want to shoot at. So I could say, right, today I'm going to shoot at aperture 2.5 because I want the background to fall out just enough so it doesn't distract the person who's going to look at it, but still keep some of the colors and a bit of the detail. Fantastic. So you set that. Now the camera will look at the environment outside and it will decide what to adjust the ISO and what to adjust the shutter speed to make sure the camera can shoot at that aperture. Now where that starts to get a little bit tricky is, say for instance you were shooting in a nightclub. So you shoot in a nightclub and I want to shoot at 1.8 in a nightclub and I'm using aperture priority mode. What I do is I open up that aperture, but the problem now is there's so much light pouring into the sensor, you know, it becomes, so there's so much light pouring into the sensor. I'm trying to think, I'm confusing myself now. So I shoot at 1.8, the camera has to cut out some of the light coming into the camera because there's so much light pouring in. So it'll either do that by dropping the ISO, or what it will do is up the shutter speed. Now that might not be great because I might want to shoot at 1A and use my flash to catch a little bit of motion. In that scenario, I'd have to drag the shutter speed to be able to catch some of that movement. In aperture priority mode, I'm not going to do that because the camera is trying to get the best exposure based on your aperture. So you are constrained to your camera's ability to understand what's going on. And in nightclubs, that doesn't work. As an example. So that's what aperture priority does, and that's a great way to start because it's not automatic and it is giving you some control. It's almost like driving an automatic car to a certain degree. So it's a good place to start. So if you move from automatic, next place go to aperture and start toying around with aperture. Start allowing the background to fall in and out of focus, which would be amazing. Then beyond that you have, so we've done automatic, we've done aperture priority, and now we have shutter priority. So shutter priority, rather than putting the aperture as dictating what goes on, it's allowing the shutter speed to do that. So for instance, I've got somebody running on track and I want to take a picture of them. I know I need a fast shutter speed to do that. So I could adjust my shutter speed, and what will happen by me adjusting my shutter speed, the camera will then decide what ISO it should use. So if I was outside and I had someone who was running really fast and I had to take my shutter speed up to, I don't know, over 1,000, and I take my shutter speed over 1,000, because my shutter's working a lot faster, it cuts the light out. So what the camera has to do then in turn is increase the ISO or increase the aperture to be able to allow enough light in to expose the camera correct. Again, constraining you to the camera's ability to decide what the right exposure is. So that's shutter priority, and the priority is what you define the shutter to be, and the camera will work the rest of it out afterwards. All great. So you move from automatic, and a good place to go would be to aperture priority or shutter priority, and you've got the ability to play around within those two. Now beyond that is manual, and manual, for me, to be completely honest, if you want to be taken seriously as a professional, you need to understand how to shoot in manual. And I'm not saying that because it's like the holy grail and it like, oh, you know, it makes me a pro shooting in manual. No, what it does is it gives you the technical ability to be able to shoot in any circumstance. And being able to shoot in any circumstance, for me, is what would define you as a professional, because you've taken enough time to educate yourself to be able to shoot in any scenario. You know, I can walk into any scenario with flashes, with speed lights and my camera and be able to come away with a good image and not be restricted to what the camera or what the camera thinks it knows best. So shooting in manual is not just some accolade like, oh, I'm a pro because I shoot in manual and I shoot raw. Like, you know, reason people shoot in manual, or reason professionals shoot in manual, is because it gives them full control over everything. And as a professional, that's what you want. You want total control over the scenario. You walk in to be able to walk away with the best image. So for instance, if I wanted to shoot if I wanted to shoot a low-key portrait and I turn up to a hotel room to shoot an artist, and I don't have a black backdrop, but I've got, you know, a light source and I've got a grid and I've got all that, my technical ability, I would know how to turn it into low-key. And I would turn it into low-key by increasing my shutter speed to cut down the ambient light pouring in and just allow the flash to create the light exposing the subject. And take it high enough and put, you know, a dark towel behind the subject or something, and all of a sudden I'm shooting in low-key. You couldn't do that if you were stuck in one of the modes that the camera's defining. And that's why you want to be shooting in manual, to take full control over any situation so you can walk away with the creative output that you want as a photographer. So how do you get there? To get there, the first thing to understand is how all of these things work. So to understand what your ISO is, to understand what your shutter speed is, and also to understand what your aperture is. So let's start with ISO, because that's probably where you would start with when you're trying to expose an image. ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. So I'm going to open this up. Inside here, there is a sensor or film. Back in the day, rather than a sensor, a semiconductor, that basically was a piece of film, okay? That has a certain sensitivity to light, and different cameras have different sensitivities. So for instance, I've got A7R2. If I was using the A7S, the A7S is far more sensitive. And what that means is in lower light situation, the camera's going to have more ability to pick out a good image. Some are specialists at this and others aren't, okay? So a camera with a good ISO rating gives you the ability to shoot in most circumstances if you don't have a flash or even if you do have a flash. So that's what your ISO does, okay? Now, with modern cameras, when you start to take up the ISO, when you get to a certain threshold, you start to notice you get noise. And back in the day, it would be deemed as grain or whatever, but you start to get digital noise. And the reason being is because the light is so low, the sensor is trying to artificially create information effectively within that space. And that starts to get noisy, a bit like upscaling 4K, upscaling standard definition TV into 4K. Like it starts to deteriorate because there's only so many times you can replicate stuff. And the higher you take it, the more noise it gets. So for a lot of photographers, they would try to stay under a certain threshold for their ISO. For me in particular, I try to stay 500 to 800 ISO. You know, 100 to 800 is my range. That's where I like to stay, and that's where I'm most comfortable, because I know in post-production, when I'm editing my images, I've got enough quality there to not deteriorate the final product. And that's just me. You can pick whatever you want, but you will find, based on your camera, there will be a threshold it starts to deteriorate. So that's your ISO. You have to understand that. You take your ISO too high, you start to deteriorate the quality of the image, okay? So where that comes into play is, okay, I'm shooting a really dark scenario, I need to take my ISO really high, I've taken my ISO really high, but the images don't look great. So, if you have the ability to shoot in manual, what you can do is you can compensate. You could then fall back on the camera's or the lens's ability to open the aperture. And in turn, you open, you open the aperture, and you bring down the ISO. And what that's going to do is it's like a counterbalance effectively. So you take the ISO down, you're losing the ability to be sensitive to light. So what you do is you allow more light in through opening the aperture. There's one way to compensate it, and you would know that if you had the ability to shoot in manual. So we've covered ISO. The next one we've got is aperture, and I've spoken about it and I've shown you a few bits. You shoot at 1.8, it's really wide open, it's allowing so much light to fall into the sensor. Okay, you start to close it down, you go to 20 and it's just a tiny minute pinhole, and that's all the light it allows to go through. Okay, but what that will do is that brings more of the image into focus. So for instance, you're going to shoot landscape, you might want to shoot at, you know, f9 or somewhere along those lines and have a longer shutter speed to allow more light in. Basically, you've taken your f-stop, you've taken it lower, so you've gone to 9 or 10, which means it's going to lose its ability to take in light because that hole's smaller. So what you do is you leave the shutter open for a longer period of time to allow more light to go in to the sensor. So another way to use manual to beat the circumstance you're in. The third one, or the third thing to look at, is shutter speed. And honestly, if there's any questions you have throughout this video, please do stick them in the comments. If you've got any more, like, please stick them in. I'm happy to answer. And you know, throw questions at me all day long, and I'll answer them as we sort of we go develop. So the next thing to consider would be our shutter speed. Now, all cameras have a shutter. Basically, my face is now the sensor, and my hands are the shutter, and they. Back in the day, they used to close like this, but what they found is in landscape mode, it takes a longer time to do this, so therefore you couldn't increase the speed of the camera because that was always defined by a mechanical process, and it takes longer to do that than it does to do that. So cameras have started getting higher shutter speeds because the engineers have decided, look, it takes less time to shoot here than it does to go across here. Most modern cameras will work up to 8 thousandths of a shutter speed. Now, the problem you get with that, and it's something to be aware of, especially if you use flash, is when you move over roughly anything from 250th of a second, and on your camera you'll be able to define that. So I could switch on my camera here, and I'll turn it back into manual. If I show you this guy here, cover my face, can you see it? Cool, we are in, I'm doing this all randomly controlled. Actually, if I turn around this way, you will be able to see. Cool. So at the bottom, you will see that little orange number changing. I'm increasing my shutter speed, so I'm leaving it open for a longer period of time. Now watch, if I take the picture, ready? Cool, so that last video I was trying to show you was absolutely awful. So the idea is I can show you here. So as I adjust this button, you can see my shutter speed. This takes it really high, up to like 8,000 per second. You see it's super dark because it's cutting out all the ambience. And this is the great thing with Sony's Live View. If I drag it all the way down, what you'll start to notice is that you start to see light in the screen. Now, I probably don't want that, so I'm going to need to adjust my aperture. So I'll take my aperture all the way down where I would normally be shooting. Say for instance like 2.8. You can see it's absolutely bleached out because of the ISO. So if I use my shutter speed, you can see that's going to give me a correct exposure, so to speak. And there we go. So that's the shutter speed. And again, you can obviously adjust the shutter. Absolutely awful demonstration. Ignore that demonstration. What I was going to show you is the shutter speed on here, but what I'll do is I'll show you in a separate video. So within the shutter speed, when you work over 250th of a second, the camera has to cheat a little bit. And the reason the camera has to cheat a little bit is because as you're doing this, it can do that up to 250th, and it can do it pretty well. But when it starts to go over that speed, it can't do that fast enough. So what the shutters do is they trick you. So they interlace. So they roll down like this, as opposed to closing, because they can roll down faster. And as you increase the speed, that little tiny slit gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and it cuts down. Now, if you're using flash and you fire a single flash of light, as it goes down here, the only thing you're going to capture is my eyes, and you're going to get black at the top and black at the bottom, and that's because the sensor's shadowed by the shutter speed. Now, if you shoot in manual and you understand that, you can overcompensate that. So with a speed light or something without high speed sync, you can only work to 250th a second. So you have to use your aperture or your ISO to be able to counteract that, to allow enough light into the scene. So shutter speed is the last one, and how my advice for anybody trying to go from shooting in automatic to manual is go and do it. Like, literally take yourself outside and shoot in as many different situations as possible, and test yourself. Find a beginning point. A lot of photographers start with the ISO. That's where they're most comfortable. They say, okay, I'll start with the ISO and I'll adjust everything within that. I quite like starting with the aperture. And the reason I quite like starting with the aperture is because I want to define how my subject stands out from their background. So I will set about with my aperture first and then develop it everything beyond that. So if I want to shoot at 2.8 or 1.8, I know automatically my ISO is going to have to come down lower because the lens is open, you know, so much light's pouring in. So I have to do that. So I challenge you, go and take a picture in daylight and go and take a picture in darkness, and also watch some other YouTube videos. For instance, if you wanted to learn how to do light trails, what you would do is you would allow your shutter speed open for a longer period of time. Okay, you take a picture of something moving as that shutter's open for a large part of time, and you will be able to follow that light traveling through the image. Okay, if you did it at a faster shutter speed, you would freeze it and you would get a crystal sharp image of what you wanted to, as opposed to a light trail. You see those cool pictures of motorways and it's the streaming lights either side. That's done for a longer exposure. And with a longer exposure, you have to either increase your aperture, okay, because there's going to be so much light pouring in. So you have to cut out some of that light pouring in because the shutter's going to be open for such a long period of time. And you have to bring down your ISO to facilitate that. If, for instance, you were, you know, shooting in a nightclub and you wanted to get people dancing on the dance floor and freeze them, you know, razor sharp, you know, you have to use the shutter speed to do that. Or what you can do is use the exposure to light to freeze the subject. And that's when we start to get really advanced. And I'm going to do a video on that a little bit later. But first of all, this is just manual. Understanding automatic, aperture priority, shutter priority, and also manual. And once you understand those elements, and honestly, you have to go out and spend a little bit more time than this video. You can't expect to watch this video and go off and be like, oh, I'm going to be able to shoot a manual. But what it should do is give you enough of a base understanding to be able to experiment with those settings. And once you've experimented with those settings, you can develop them further and start to look at different styles of photography to create the images that you want. And again, you know, just to summarize and finish, the only reason you know, the strongest reason for wanting to shoot in manual for any photographer is so you are in total control of any situation you walk into, regardless. You can turn up into any situation anywhere, and you know you have the technical ability to come away with the images that you or your client want. And that's why you want to shoot in manual, because the camera is going to be limited to a certain degree, and there will be a point where the camera lets you down and won't give you the images you desire. So that's why you want to shoot in manual. Hopefully this video has been useful, and I hope it was not too technical. If you have any questions, like I said, please put them into the comments. And yeah, I'm happy to answer questions all day long. Feel free to check out my website. So I'm at www.lukecurtis.co.uk. I'm also on Instagram, which is at lukecurtis.co.uk. So feel free to check out my work. You'll get an idea of what I'm about. Like it, follow, and if you like this video, subscribe, and I'll keep on producing more. Cheers guys, take care.